The restaurant manager humiliates and kicks Snoop Dogg out, but then he shocks everyone. The neon glow of Los Angeles set the stage for what should have been a night of celebration, but an unthinkable humiliation awaited. When Snoop Dogg arrived at the city's most exclusive restaurant, he was met not with the respect his legacy commands, but with a manager's cold dismissal, his reservation lost, and his presence unwelcome. The whispers of diners, the condescension, and the thinly veiled discrimination hit like a familiar yet deeply personal blow. But what happened next left everyone stunned. Snoop's quiet dignity turned rejection into a movement that would redefine inclusion, forever altering the world of fine dining. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you love this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. The neon lights of Los Angeles painted ribbons of color across the gleaming black surface of Snoop Dogg's Cadillac Escalade as it glided through the evening streets. Rain from an earlier shower had left the asphalt glistening, creating a mirror-like effect that doubled every storefront sign and street lamp. The city hummed with its usual electricity, the pulse of music from nearby clubs, the occasional blast of a car horn, and the constant murmur of voices on the sidewalks. Inside the Escalade, Snoop adjusted his emerald cufflinks, catching a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror. His black suit was immaculate, custom-tailored to his tall frame, with subtle pinstripes that caught the light just so. A platinum chain, simple but elegant, completed the look. Tonight wasn't about flash. It was about celebration, about milestones with the people who'd been there from the beginning. As he navigated through downtown, memories flickered through his mind like an old film reel. The early days in Long Beach, recording in makeshift studios, the countless nights spent perfecting verses until sunrise. He remembered the doubters, the closed doors, the industry executives who couldn't or wouldn't see beyond their own preconceptions. But he also remembered the believers. Jason, his right-hand man for over 2 decades. Tina, the sharp-minded marketing wizard who'd joined their team 5 years ago and changed the game. And the young artists they were mentoring, hungry for their own shot at greatness. His phone buzzed with a text from Jason. Already near Eminence. Place looks insane. You're gonna love this, boss. It was Abby's favorite flavor. Snoop smiled, tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with the jazz playing softly through the car's premium sound system. He'd chosen Eminence Dining deliberately for tonight's celebration. The restaurant had opened 6 months ago to rave reviews, quickly becoming the most exclusive dining spot in LA. Getting a reservation had taken pulling some strings, but tonight was special. Their label had just signed 3 promising new artists, and their existing roster was breaking streaming records left and right. On my way, he texted back at a red light. Keep the team warm. Tonight we celebrating proper. Man, you know it, Jason replied instantly. Tina's already talking about champagne towers. These young ones don't know what they're in for. The easy banter with Jason brought another smile to Snoop's face. They'd come so far from those early days when success seemed like a distant dream. Now they were building something bigger than themselves, a legacy that would open doors for the next generation. As he approached Eminence Dining, the restaurant's facade came into view, and Snoop had to admit it lived up to the hype. The building was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and dramatic angles, with walls of glass that revealed glimpses of the elegant interior. Warm light spilled onto the street from artfully arranged fixtures, and a red carpet extended from the entrance to the valet station. Valet attendants, dressed in crisp black uniforms, moved with practiced efficiency as they handled the high-set vehicles of the restaurant's wealthy clientele. Snoop pulled up to the valet station and a young attendant approached his window. The man's eyes widened slightly in recognition, but his professional demeanor never wavered. "Welcome to Eminence Dining, sir. I'll take excellent care of your vehicle." As Snoop stepped out of the Escalade, he could see his team gathered near the entrance. Jason, tall and distinguished in his navy suit, was gesturing animatedly as he talked to Tina, who wore a stunning red dress that commanded attention. The three new artists, Marcus, Deja, and Antoine, stood nearby, trying to maintain their cool, but barely containing their excitement. This was their first time at a place like Eminence, and their wide-eyed looks at the opulent surroundings made Snoop remember his own first taste of success. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the restaurant's carefully manicured landscaping. As Snoop handed his keys to the valet, he caught the subtle exchange of glances between two attendants. It was nothing overt, nothing he could call out, but he'd seen that look countless times before, that mixture of surprise and unease that some people still couldn't hide when confronted with success that didn't fit their expectations. He pushed the observation aside. Tonight wasn't about that. Tonight was about celebration, about marking achievements and looking toward the future. As he walked toward his team, Snoop felt a sense of pride and purpose. They'd earned their place at any table in this city, including the most exclusive ones. Tonight they would dine like the kings and queens they were. Stepping through Eminence Dining's glass doors felt like entering another world entirely. The restaurant's interior was a study in understated luxury, with soaring ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow over everything below. The air carried the subtle fragrance of fresh flowers, arrangements of white orchids and roses positioned strategically throughout the space, mingled with the promising aromas of fine cuisine. The main dining room stretched out before them, a symphony of dark mahogany cream-colored walls and tables draped in pristine white linens. Each table setting gleamed with polished silver and crystal stemware that caught and reflected the light. Well-heeled diners engaged in hushed conversations, their voices creating a gentle murmur that blended with the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers. At the hostess stand, a young woman in a perfectly pressed black dress stood behind a sleek podium of polished marble. Her posture was impeccable, her smile practiced and professional as she greeted other arriving guests. The rest of the staff moved through the space with practiced precision, their black and white uniforms crisp and spotless, their movements carefully choreographed to appear effortless. As Snoop's group approached the hostess stand, the subtle shift in atmosphere was almost imperceptible. Almost. The hostess's smile flickered for just a moment as she took in the party of six, her eyes lingering a fraction too long on their faces. Her fingers, which had been smoothly turning pages in the reservation book, suddenly became stiff and mechanical. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of formality. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Snoop replied smoothly. "Under Broadus, party of 6, 8 p.m. The hostess began scanning the reservation book with exaggerated care, flipping pages back and forth while avoiding direct eye contact. "I'm having trouble locating your reservation. Are you certain it was for tonight?" Standing slightly behind Snoop, Tina's keen eyes took in the scene unfolding around them. She noticed how the nearest diners had subtly shifted in their seats to watch the interaction, their conversations dropping to whispers behind raised hands. A waiter who had been approaching with water glasses suddenly changed course, making a wide berth around their group. Even more telling was the way other staff members had begun to cluster near the kitchen entrance, exchanging meaningful glances. Tina leaned close to Jason, keeping her voice low. "You see what I'm seeing? We're becoming the evening's entertainment." Jason nodded almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening. The three young artists, Marcus, Deja, and Antoine, shifted uncomfortably, their earlier excitement dampened by the growing tension. The click of expensive shoes on marble announced a new presence. The restaurant manager appeared as if summoned, moving with the confident air of someone used to handling what he considered difficult situations. He was middle-aged with graying temples and a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His smile was practiced but didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and assessing as he approached the hostess stand. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he already knew the answer and had decided how this situation would play out. He positioned himself slightly in front of the hostess, creating a subtle barrier between Snoop's group and the podium. His posture, while seemingly relaxed, carried an air of dismissive authority that set the stage for what was to come. "Mr. Peterson," the hostess said, relief evident in her voice, "I was just explaining that I'm having trouble locating their reservation." The manager, Mr. Peterson, gave a smile that might have appeared apologetic, if not for the hint of satisfaction lurking at its corners. "I see. Well, let me see if I can help sort this out." Mr. Peterson made a show of examining the reservation book, his manicured finger trailing down the page with deliberate slowness. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he flipped through several pages, though his eyes barely seemed to scan the entries. Finally, he looked up, his expression a masterpiece of regret. "I'm terribly sorry, but I don't see any reservation under that name. Are you certain you confirmed it?" His tone carried the faintest suggestion that such an oversight would be typical of them rather than his staff. Snoop maintained his composure, though his voice carried an edge of steel beneath its calm surface. "We confirmed twice. Yesterday afternoon and again this morning. Spoke with someone named Sarah." The manager's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Sarah isn't working today, unfortunately, and I'm afraid without a confirmed reservation, we simply can't accommodate a party of your size this evening." He gestured vaguely at the dining room where several empty tables were clearly visible. "We're fully committed with prior reservations." "Prior reservations," Jason repeated, his voice rising slightly as he stepped forward. "You mean those empty tables I'm looking at right now?" The muscles in his jaw worked as he struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. "Let's be real clear about what's happening here. We made a reservation. We confirmed it. Twice. And now suddenly it's disappeared?" Mr. Peterson's smile tightened. "Sir, I understand you're disappointed, but I assure you we treat all our guests equally. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments down the street? I'd be happy to make a recommendation." Jason's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "More comfortable? You mean somewhere more our speed? Why don't you just say what you really mean?" Throughout the dining room, conversations had died down as other patrons openly stared at the unfolding scene. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction with barely concealed interest. A woman at a nearby table whispered loudly to her companion, "Isn't that Snoop Dogg? I thought he owned restaurants himself." The public attention seemed to amuse Mr. Peterson, whose condescending smile grew more pronounced. "If you continue to make a scene, I'll have to ask security to escort you out. We wouldn't want things to become uncomfortable." Snoop placed a steady hand on Jason's shoulder, feeling the tension vibrating through his friend's body. The gesture was as much about restraint as it was about support. Through years of friendship, he knew Jason felt each slight, each dismissal, each casual act of discrimination as personally as if it were directed at him alone. "We're done here," Snoop said quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Let's go." The group turned to leave, their backs straight and heads held high despite the weight of dozens of stares following their exit. As they walked through the dining room, the whispers grew louder, a wave of murmured commentary and barely suppressed laughter washing over them. Near the door, a young server who had witnessed everything dropped her gaze to the floor as they passed, her face flushed with second-hand embarrassment, or perhaps shame at her own complicity in the establishment's practices. Outside, the cool evening air did little to dispel the heavy atmosphere surrounding the group. The same valet who had greeted them so professionally earlier now couldn't meet their eyes as he hurried to retrieve their vehicles. The red carpet that had seemed so welcoming on arrival now felt like a walk of shame, each step a reminder of the invisible barriers that still existed in their world. In the parking lot, the carefully maintained composure began to crack. Tina paced in tight circles, her heels clicking against the asphalt like angry percussion. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she fumed, her voice trembling with rage. "We need to put them on blast. I've got contacts at every major media outlet in LA. By morning, everyone will know exactly what kind of establishment Eminence Dining really is." Jason stood with his back to the restaurant, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Man, I knew something felt off the moment we walked in. Did you see how that manager looked at us? Like we were trying to crash some exclusive party we didn't deserve to be at?" He turned to Snoop, who hadn't spoken since their exit. "We can't let this slide. This isn't just about us. It's about every person who's ever been turned away because they didn't fit someone else's image of belonging." Snoop remained silent, his expression unreadable as he watched the young artists, Marcus, Deja, and Antoine, huddled together near his Escalade. Their earlier excitement had been replaced by a familiar look he'd seen too many times before. The dawning realization that success, money, and fame didn't shield you from certain realities. The drive home felt longer than usual, the streets of Los Angeles stretching endlessly before him. As Snoop navigated through traffic, memories surfaced unbidden, moments from throughout his career, when success hadn't been enough to guarantee equal treatment. He remembered business meetings where executives spoke to his white managers instead of him, high-end stores where security followed him despite his designer clothes, and countless other small indignities that accumulated like layers of sediment, building up over time into something heavy and immovable. The radio played softly in the background, but Snoop barely registered the music. His mind kept returning to the young artists who had witnessed tonight's humiliation. They'd worked so hard, believed so deeply in the dream that talent and dedication would open any door. Tonight had shown them a harsh truth, that some doors remained stubbornly closed, barred by prejudices that persisted despite all progress. What burned most wasn't the personal slight he'd faced worse and survived. It was the realization that despite all the changes he'd seen in his lifetime, despite all the barriers he'd helped break down, places like Eminence Dining still existed, their discrimination now wrapped in polite smiles and convenient excuses rather than outright hostility. At home, Snoop settled into his studio, the familiar space, usually a source of comfort, but tonight feeling somehow different. The walls, covered in platinum records and awards, seemed to mock the evening's events. All these achievements, all this success, and still they couldn't get a table at a restaurant. The irony was bitter. He sat in his favorite chair, the leather worn soft from years of use, and pulled out his phone. The screen reflected his face in the darkness, tired, angry, but also determined. Something needed to be said, needed to be done. Not just for himself, but for every person who'd ever been made to feel less than, who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Snoop adjusted the studio lights and positioned his phone on the stand, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. He hadn't changed out of his suit from the evening, the same elegant attire that hadn't been enough to grant him entry to Eminence Dining. It seemed fitting now, a visual reminder of the evening's events. With a deep breath, he pressed record. "I'm coming to you tonight with something heavy on my heart," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences. "Tonight, I was turned away from Eminence Dining, not because they were full, not because we didn't have a reservation, but because we didn't fit their image of who belongs there." His words came slowly, deliberately, each one chosen with care. As he spoke, the raw emotion of the evening surfaced in his voice. He described not just tonight's incident, but the broader pattern it represented. "This isn't about me not getting a table at some fancy restaurant. This is about every person who's ever walked into a place and been made to feel like they don't deserve to be there. Every person who's done everything right, dressed right, talked right, achieved success, and still gets looked at like they're somehow less than human." The words flowed naturally now, fueled by years of observation and experience. To the young people out there facing this kind of treatment, I see you. To the ones working twice as hard just to get half as far, I feel you. And to places like Eminence Dining, who think they can hide their discrimination behind polite smiles and convenient excuses, we see through you. Within hours of posting the video, it exploded across social media platforms. The raw honesty of Snoop's message struck a chord that resonated far beyond his usual audience. Comments flooded in by the thousands, then tens of thousands, as people shared their own stories of exclusion and discrimination. "Happened to me last month at a different upscale restaurant," wrote one commenter. "They said they were full but kept seating other people who walked in after us." Another shared, "I'm a doctor, and I still get asked if I'm in the right place when I go to medical conferences. This isn't just about restaurants, it's everywhere." The hashtag Table for All began trending, becoming a rallying cry for those who'd faced similar experiences. People shared videos, photos, and stories of their own encounters with discrimination in spaces that claimed to be exclusive but practiced exclusion. Celebrity friends and industry figures began resharing Snoop's video, adding their own experiences and calling for accountability. Athletes, musicians, actors, successful people from all walks of life stepped forward to confirm that status and wealth hadn't shielded them from similar treatment. By morning, major news outlets had picked up the story. Entertainment Tonight ran a special segment featuring Snoop's video, alongside interviews with other celebrities who'd faced similar discrimination. The Los Angeles Times published a front-page article examining the broader pattern of discrimination in high-X establishments. Civil rights activists and community leaders began speaking out, connecting Snoop's experience to the larger struggle for equality. Social justice organizations called for investigations into Eminence Dining's practices, and local politicians demanded accountability. Investigative journalists started digging deeper, uncovering a pattern of similar incidents at Eminence Dining that had gone unreported. Former employees came forward with stories of unwritten policies and coded language used to discriminate against certain customers. What had started as one man's experience was rapidly expanding into a broader examination of systemic discrimination in the hospitality industry. The social media storm surrounding Eminence Dining intensified with each passing hour. Negative reviews flooded their online profiles, with past customers coming forward to share their own experiences of discrimination at the establishment. The restaurant's carefully curated 5-star rating plummeted as people recounted similar stories of mysteriously lost reservations and suspicious claims of being fully booked, despite visible empty tables. Local food bloggers began pulling their positive reviews, with several publishing lengthy apologies for having promoted an establishment that practiced discrimination. Food critics who had praised the restaurant's exclusive atmosphere now found themselves questioning whether they had inadvertently celebrated a culture of exclusion. The hashtag Boycott Eminence gained traction, with influential food influencers and local celebrities publicly pledging never to dine there. Protesters began gathering outside the restaurant each evening, their presence documented by news crews and shared across social media. They carried signs with messages like, "No table for hate," and "Discrimination leaves a bitter taste," creating a powerful visual reminder of the community's rejection of such practices. After 48 hours of mounting pressure, Eminence Dining finally released a statement through their PR firm. The carefully worded message read like a masterclass in corporate deflection. "We at Eminence Dining deeply regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred during Mr. Broaddus's visits to our establishment. We pride ourselves on providing exceptional service to all our guests and have strict policies against discrimination of any kind. We are conducting a thorough internal review of our reservation and seating procedures to ensure they align with our commitment to inclusivity." The response only fueled the controversy. Social media users quickly dissected the statement, pointing out how it avoided taking responsibility while subtly suggesting that the incident had been a mere misunderstanding. Critics noted the absence of a direct apology and the use of passive language that distanced the restaurant from its actions. Even Mr. Peterson's earlier behavior came under scrutiny as security footage from the incident began circulating online, showing his dismissive body language and condescending smile in stark detail. The contrast between his practiced politeness and obvious disdain became a talking point in discussions about modern forms of discrimination. Meanwhile, support for Snoop's stance grew far beyond the entertainment industry. Civil rights organizations issued statements comparing the incident to historical patterns of discrimination. The NAACP released a powerful statement connecting Eminence dining's practices to the broader struggle for equality in public spaces. Legal advocacy groups offered to investigate potential civil rights violations. Prominent business leaders began speaking out as well. The CEO of a major tech company shared her own experiences of being questioned about her belonging in exclusive spaces. A renowned restaurateur published an open letter about the responsibility of the hospitality industry to combat discrimination, announcing a new initiative to audit hiring and service practices across his restaurant group. Local government officials joined the conversation, with city council members calling for a review of Eminence Dining's business licenses and permits. The mayor's office announced plans to strengthen anti-discrimination regulations for businesses operating in the city, citing the incident as evidence of the need for greater oversight and accountability. 3 days after the incident, Snoop called an emergency meeting at his home studio. Tina arrived first, her laptop already open to a document filled with media coverage and social analytics. Jason followed shortly after, carrying a thick folder of emails and messages from supporters. As they settled into the familiar space, the energy was different from their usual business meetings. There was a sense of purpose, of possibility. "We've got their attention," Tina began, scrolling through her data. "But outrage fades. We need to transform this moment into something lasting." She looked up at Snoop and Jason. "What if we created something that doesn't just point out the problem, but actually solves it?" Jason leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" "Instead of fighting to get a seat at their table," Tina continued, her voice gaining enthusiasm, "what if we built our own? Not just any table, but one that celebrates everything they tried to exclude." Snoop, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, nodded slowly. "A space where everyone's welcome, where the food, the music, the whole vibe says, you belong here." "Exactly," Tina exclaimed. "We bring together chefs who've been overlooked by the fine dining establishment, artists who've faced similar barriers, musicians who understand what it means to be shut out. We create an experience that's both a celebration and a statement." The concept began to take shape as they discussed details. Jason suggested using a warehouse space, transforming it into something that could rival any upscale restaurant while maintaining its own authentic character. Snoop envisioned a fusion of cultures and cuisines, breaking down the artificial barriers between fine dining and authentic community food traditions. He said the transcendent style and mindfulness of the city and refined the restaurant quite a bit before finally figuring out what families could eat. Within hours, they had a name, A Table for All. The planning phase moved with incredible speed, driven by the urgency of the moment and the overwhelming support pouring in from all directions. Tina reached out to her network of contacts, connecting with chefs who had their own stories of discrimination to share. A James Beard-nominated chef who'd been repeatedly passed over for promotional opportunities despite his talents immediately signed on. A celebrated pastry chef who'd faced skepticism about her traditional African desserts joining fine dining menus offered to create a special menu. Jason focused on the venue, securing a historic warehouse in downtown LA. The space's industrial bones would serve as a perfect canvas for their vision. Its raw authenticity, a deliberate contrast to Eminence Dining's manufactured exclusivity. Local artists offered to create installations that would transform the space, each piece telling its own story of resilience and celebration. Snoop leveraged his music industry connections, but not in the way many expected. Instead of seeking big names, he reached out to talented performers who'd been told their sound was too ethnic for mainstream venues. A jazz ensemble that blended traditional African instruments with modern compositions signed on. A classical pianist who'd been told she didn't look the part for concert halls agreed to perform. As word of the event spread online, the response exceeded all expectations. The hashtag Table for All evolved from a protest against discrimination into a symbol of positive change. People began sharing their own visions of what true inclusivity could look like in the hospitality industry. Chefs posted videos of fusion dishes that honored their heritage. While pushing culinary boundaries, musicians uploaded clips of rehearsals, showing how different cultural traditions could blend into something new and beautiful. When they announced the date for the first dinner, the response crashed their website. Messages poured in from around the country, with people offering to help in any way they could. A renowned sommelier volunteered to curate a wine list, highlighting underrepresented vintners. A group of art students offered to document the event through photography and film. Small business owners reached out about providing everything from linens to lighting. The warehouse transformation exceeded even Tina's meticulous vision. Strings of warm Edison bulbs crisscrossed the soaring ceiling, casting a gentle glow that softened the industrial edges while highlighting the building's character. The exposed brick walls became galleries, showcasing artwork that told stories of identity, resistance, and celebration. A massive mural dominated one wall, depicting a diverse array of hands reaching toward a shared table, created by a collective of street artists who'd been told their work didn't belong in traditional galleries. Local craftspeople had built long communal tables from reclaimed wood, their natural grain patterns enhanced by careful restoration. Instead of the stark white linens of upscale restaurants, the tables featured hand-woven runners in vibrant patterns, each created by artisans celebrating their cultural heritage. The place settings mixed elegant silverware with handmade ceramic plates, each piece telling its own story of tradition and innovation. The open kitchen buzzed with energy as chefs worked side by side, their diverse cooking styles creating an intoxicating blend of aromas. Steam rose from pots of aromatic curry while grills sizzled with perfectly marinated meats. A pastry station displayed desserts that fused classical French techniques with flavors from around the world. Each dish was conceived as both a culinary achievement and a celebration of its creator's journey. Musicians set up in various corners of the space, creating intimate performance areas that would allow music to flow naturally throughout the evening. The stage area featured a grand piano positioned near traditional African drums, a physical representation of the cultural bridges they intended to build. As the first guests began to arrive, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. The entrance had been designed to set the tone immediately. Instead of a formal podium, guests were greeted by young artists who'd been part of Snoop's mentorship program, each trained to welcome people with genuine warmth rather than practiced formality. The crowd that gathered reflected the vision perfectly. A mix of celebrities and community members, established chefs and aspiring food truck owners, classical musicians and street performers. Everyone who entered seemed to pause for a moment, taking in the space with visible emotion. Many had read about the event's purpose, but experiencing the physical manifestation of inclusive luxury struck a deeper chord. Snoop watched from a quiet corner as people found their seats, noting how naturally conversations flowed between strangers who might never have crossed paths otherwise. There was none of the stiff formality of traditional fine dining. Instead, the space hummed with genuine connection and shared excitement. As the evening's formal program began, Tina took the stage, her voice carrying clear emotion. "Welcome to a table for all," she began. "A space where every story matters, where every tradition adds flavor, where every person belongs." She shared her own experiences of exclusion in the corporate world, drawing knowing nods from many in the audience. The performances that followed wove together like a carefully composed symphony. The classical pianist transitioned seamlessly into a duet with the African drum ensemble, creating something entirely new, yet deeply rooted in both traditions. A spoken word artist delivered a powerful piece about belonging, while chefs presented dishes that represented their heritage with contemporary flair. Throughout the evening, guests began sharing their own stories, spontaneously. A successful businessman spoke about still feeling out of place in certain spaces despite his achievements. A young chef described how her innovative takes on traditional dishes had been dismissed as too ethnic for fine dining. Each story seemed to unlock more, creating a chain reaction of shared experiences and understanding. One particularly moving moment came when an elderly woman stood up to speak. She described attending segregated restaurants in her youth and how tonight's event felt like a fulfillment of long-held dreams. "This," she said, gesturing to the vibrant space around her, "this is what we were fighting for. Not just a seat at their table, but the freedom to create something better." While a table for all celebrated inclusion, Eminence Dining faced an increasingly dire situation as former employees began coming forward with detailed accounts of the restaurant's discriminatory practices. Sarah, the hostess mentioned in Snoop's original reservation confirmation, broke her silence in a detailed social media thread that quickly went viral. She described an elaborate coding system used in the reservation book, subtle marks that identified customers' races and backgrounds, allowing staff to manage the restaurant's demographic makeup on any given night. A former server, James Chen, shared his experiences in a television interview, describing how management used carefully worded directives to discriminate without explicitly saying so. "They told us to maintain the restaurant's atmosphere," he explained, his voice tight with suppressed anger. That meant steering certain customers to less visible tables, or suddenly discovering problems with reservations when the wrong type of person showed up. The most damaging testimony came from a former assistant manager who had kept detailed notes during her employment. She revealed how Mr. Peterson had conducted training sessions that taught staff to use specific phrases and tactics to deter undesirable customers while maintaining plausible deniability. Her documentation included emails, internal memos, and recordings that left little room for doubt about the systematic nature of the discrimination. The media coverage shifted from reporting on a single incident to exposing a deeply entrenched culture of discrimination. Major networks ran special reports examining how upscale establishments used subtle tactics to maintain exclusionary practices in the modern era. Social justice organizations began using Eminence Dining as a case study in how discrimination had evolved to become more sophisticated, but no less harmful. Restaurant industry publications, which had previously celebrated Eminence Dining's exclusive atmosphere, now published scathing analyses of how such terminology often served as coded language for discriminatory practices. Food critics wrote soul-searching pieces about their own role in celebrating establishments that masked exclusion behind a veneer of luxury. The story gained additional momentum when other high-profile restaurants faced similar accusations, suggesting a broader pattern across the upscale dining industry. Eminence Dining became a symbol of everything wrong with elite establishments that confused exclusivity with exclusion. The impact on Eminence Dining's business was swift and severe. Reservations dropped by 70% in the first week after Snoop's video, then plummeted further as the employee testimonies emerged. The restaurant's attempts to maintain normal operations became increasingly futile as protesters maintained a constant presence outside, their cameras documenting every would-be diner who chose to cross the picket line. Major investors began distancing themselves from the establishment. A prominent restaurant group that had been considering acquiring Eminence Dining publicly withdrew their offer, citing concerns about irreconcilable differences in values. Celebrity chefs who had done guest appearances in the kitchen requested that their names be removed from all promotional materials. The final blow came when the restaurant's landlord initiated proceedings to terminate their lease, citing a morality clause in the contract. Property owners in other upscale locations made it known that they would not welcome Eminence Dining as a tenant, effectively blocking any attempt to relocate. Rumors of impending bankruptcy began circulating in industry circles, with suppliers reporting that the restaurant had fallen behind on payments. The success of Los Angeles' first A Table for All event sparked a wave of inspiration across the country. In Chicago, a collective of South Side restaurateurs reached out to Tina for guidance on organizing their own dinner. They envisioned transforming an abandoned theater into a celebration of the city's diverse culinary heritage. From soul food to Polish pierogi to Mexican street cuisine, the Chicago event took on its own character, incorporating the city's rich jazz tradition and featuring local artists who'd been excluded from the prestigious Michigan Avenue galleries. Atlanta's response was particularly powerful, with civil rights leaders seeing A Table for All as a natural evolution of their ongoing struggle for equality. They chose a historic church hall for their venue, a space that had once hosted planning meetings for lunch counter sit-ins during the 1960s. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The same space that had witnessed the fight against segregation now celebrated the community's achievements, while acknowledging the work still to be done. New York's interpretation spread across multiple boroughs, with events popping up from Brooklyn warehouses to Queens community centers. Each neighborhood brought its own flavor to the concept, creating a tapestry of experiences that reflected the city's incredible diversity. The Bronx event particularly stood out, featuring Puerto Rican grandmothers cooking alongside Michelin-starred chefs, their collaborative dishes telling stories of tradition and innovation. Across these cities, local talents seized the opportunity to showcase their skills and share their experiences. In Atlanta, Chef Marcus Williams transformed his grandmother's sweet potato pie recipe into an elegant dessert that honored both his fine dining training and his family heritage. His creation became a symbol of how tradition could be elevated without being erased, earning coverage in several food magazines that had previously overlooked his work. Chicago's event featured Maria Gonzalez, a street food vendor whose tamales had developed a cult following, but who'd been repeatedly denied permits for a brick-and-mortar restaurant. Given the chance to work in a proper kitchen, she created a tasting menu that had food critics rethinking their definitions of fine dining. Her story, picked up by local news, sparked discussions about city licensing policies and their impact on immigrant entrepreneurs. In Brooklyn, a collective of Haitian American artists created installations that transformed the dining space into an immersive celebration of their culture. Their work caught the attention of gallery owners, who'd previously shown little interest in Caribbean art, leading to several prestigious exhibitions and a broader conversation about representation in the art world. The national media began taking notice of how each city added its own character to the movement while maintaining the core message of inclusion and celebration. The New York Times ran a Sunday feature examining how A Table for All was reshaping conversations about food, culture, and belonging. The article highlighted how the movement was breaking down artificial barriers between high and low cuisine, between traditional and contemporary art forms. NPR's All Things Considered produced a series exploring the personal stories behind each city's events, capturing the voices of participants and organizers. The interviews revealed a common thread: people who'd been told their food wasn't sophisticated enough, their art wasn't refined enough, or their music wasn't appropriate for upscale venues, were finally finding spaces where their full creativity could flourish. Television networks began producing specials that showcased the movement's impact. Food Network aired a documentary following chefs as they prepared for events in different cities, while PBS created a series examining how A Table for All was influencing broader conversations about culture and identity in America. These programs helped spread the movement's message to audiences who might never attend an actual event. As A Table for All gained prominence, voices of opposition began to emerge. Several prominent food critics wrote scathing editorials suggesting the movement was lowering culinary standards in the name of inclusion. One particularly vocal critic in the New York Times dining section argued that not every meal needs to be a social justice statement, claiming that not every meal needs to be a social justice statement. The article sparked heated debates in culinary circles about the very nature of haute cuisine. Conservative media outlets seized on the controversy, framing the movement as an attack on traditional institutions. Talk show hosts questioned whether the emphasis on cultural diversity was overshadowing culinary excellence, while social media personalities accused the movement of reverse discrimination against established restaurants. Some even suggested that Snoop's initial video had been a calculated publicity stunt, rather than a genuine response to discrimination. Industry traditionalists joined the chorus of criticism, with several Michelin-starred chefs publicly dismissing the movement as amateur hour dressed up as innovation. They argued that true fine dining required years of classical training and adherence to established culinary traditions, implying that the diverse cooking styles celebrated at a table-for-all events somehow fell short of these standards. The internal team gathered at Snoop's studio to address the mounting criticism. Tina paced the room, scrolling through her phone as she read out the latest negative headlines. Jason sat quietly, his usual energy dampened by concern about how the backlash might affect their young artists and chefs. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever as they discussed how to respond without compromising their values. "Maybe we need to tone it down a bit," one team member suggested. "Focus more on the food and less on the message." But Snoop shook his head, his expression resolute. The criticism had only strengthened his conviction about the movement's importance. Rising from his chair, Snoop moved to the center of the room, commanding everyone's attention without saying a word. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet power that had made his initial video so compelling. "They're scared because we're changing the game," he began. "We're not just making noise, we're making history. Every critic who says we're lowering standards is really just admitting they never believed excellence could come from anywhere but their own narrow world." His words galvanized the team as he continued. "This movement isn't about bringing anything down. It's about lifting people up who've been pushed aside for too long. When they say we're being divisive, what they really mean is we're refusing to accept division. Every person who walks through our doors, every chef who shares their story, every artist who brings their culture to our table, they're proving that true excellence doesn't need gatekeepers." Snoop's response resonated far beyond the team meeting. In interviews and social media posts, he consistently returned to the movement's core message of celebration rather than rejection. He invited critics to attend events and see for themselves how diversity enhanced rather than diminished the dining experience. When asked about allegations of reverse discrimination, he simply pointed to the movement's name, a table for all, emphasizing that everyone was welcome, including those who might have initially opposed it. 1 year after the incident at Eminence Dining, the warehouse that hosted the first A Table for All event underwent another transformation, this time even more spectacular than the first. The space had been expanded to accommodate twice the original capacity, with retractable glass panels in the ceiling letting in natural light during the day and offering views of the stars at night. The walls, now permanently adorned with rotating art installations, told the story of the movement's growth through photographs and artifacts from events across the country. Guests began arriving early, their excitement palpable as they entered the space. Representatives from every city that had hosted an event made the journey to Los Angeles, each bringing unique contributions to the celebration. Chicago's contingent arrived with blues musicians and soul food chefs. Atlanta's delegation brought civil rights veterans and emerging hip-hop artists. New York's team included Broadway performers and street food vendors who'd become local celebrities through the movement. The dining area featured an innovative setup that reflected the evening's theme of interconnection. Instead of separate tables, the space contained one continuous table that wound through the room in an elaborate spiral, symbolizing how all participants were part of a single, unbroken community. The place settings mixed elements from various cultures. Traditional African drinking vessels stood alongside crystal wine glasses. As the room filled to capacity, the energy built to an electric intensity. Chefs from across the country worked side by side in the open kitchen, creating a menu that told the story of American cuisine through its diverse influences. The air filled with an intoxicating blend of aromas, fresh herbs, sizzling spices, and sweet desserts, coming together in a sensory celebration of unity. When Snoop took the stage, the room fell into a hushed anticipation. He stood for a moment, taking in the scene before him, a living embodiment of the vision that had emerged from that night of rejection 1 year ago. When he spoke, his voice carried both power and vulnerability. Imagination created something new and innovated all of the ideas perfect. So did day-night. They thought they were protecting something precious by keeping people out. But what we've created here, this is precious. This is what happens when we stop asking for permission to belong and start building spaces where everyone belongs by design. He gestured to the gathered crowd, his voice gaining strength. Look around you. Every person in this room has a story of being told, not here, not you, not now. But instead of letting those rejections define us, we used them to fuel something beautiful. We turned exclusion into inclusion, discrimination into celebration, rejection into creation. The emotion in his voice deepened as he continued. This movement isn't about revenge or retaliation. It's about redemption, not just for those who were excluded, but for the very idea of what excellence and luxury can mean. We're not trying to get a seat at their table anymore. We're building better tables, and we're inviting everyone to sit with us. As Snoop's speech concluded, the evening's performances began, each one building on the emotional resonance of his words. A young classical pianist who'd been told she didn't have the right look for concert halls performed a piece that blended Chopin with jazz improvisations. Her music flowed seamlessly into a performance by a traditional Chinese erhu player, creating an unexpected but beautiful harmony. Spoken word artists took turns at the microphone, their verses weaving together stories of struggle and triumph. A poet from Atlanta delivered a powerful piece about his grandmother's recipes being dismissed as too ethnic for fine dining, only to have those same flavors celebrated now as culinary innovations from the crowd. The evening reached its emotional peak when a multi-generational choir took the stage, featuring singers from every city that had hosted an event. Their voices rose in a song specially composed for the occasion, its lyrics celebrating resilience and unity, while its melody drew from gospel, soul, and classical traditions. As they sang, dancers moved through the space, their movements telling stories of exclusion transformed into embrace, of barriers broken and bridges built. In a fitting coincidence, the morning after the 1-year anniversary celebration, Eminence Dining announced its permanent closure. The statement, issued through their attorneys, cited insurmountable business challenges rather than acknowledging the true cause of their downfall. The building that had once symbolized exclusivity stood empty, its windows papered over, its valet stand abandoned. Former patrons walked past without a second glance, the allure of manufactured exclusivity having lost its shine. Local food critics noted the poetry of the timing. As one vision of dining excellence crumbled, another rose to take its place. The restaurant's closure made headlines, but not for the reasons its owners might have once hoped. Instead, it became a case study in how quickly institutions could fall when their foundations rested on discrimination rather than true hospitality. Some of Eminence's former staff found new opportunities within the A Table for All network, including several servers who shared their relief at no longer having to enforce discriminatory policies. Even Mr. Peterson's departure sparked change. His position was filled by a pioneering restaurant manager who'd spent years advocating for more inclusive hiring practices in fine dining. The movement's influence extended far beyond the restaurant industry. Art galleries began examining their exhibition practices, leading to new initiatives supporting underrepresented artists. Music venues that had once booked acts based on narrow commercial appeal now sought out diverse performers. Corporate dining spaces and private clubs started reviewing their membership policies and cultural biases. Educational institutions took notice as well. Culinary schools incorporated courses on cultural competency and inclusive hospitality into their curricula. Business schools used A Table for All as a case study in ethical leadership and community-driven innovation. The movement had sparked conversations about representation and belonging, that reached into every corner of American cultural life. Major corporations began approaching the movement's organizers for guidance on creating more inclusive environments. What had started as a response to restaurant discrimination was evolving into a broader template for institutional change. The term "a table for all" entered the cultural lexicon as shorthand for genuine, substantive inclusion. One quiet evening, weeks after the anniversary celebration, Snoop sat in his studio, reviewing footage from events across the country. The screens showed faces lit with joy, people sharing meals and stories, barriers dissolving through the simple act of breaking bread together. Each image reflected a piece of the change they'd helped create. His phone buzzed with messages from team members, sharing news of upcoming events, a series in London, inquiries from Tokyo, plans for a Pan-African celebration in Johannesburg. The movement had taken on a life of its own, growing in ways he could never have imagined that night outside Eminence dining. "We didn't just change where people eat," he mused, speaking his thoughts into a voice memo. "We changed how people think about belonging. Every person who walks through our doors learns that excellence doesn't have to mean exclusion. Every meal we serve proves that tradition and innovation can strengthen each other. Every event shows that true luxury isn't about keeping people out, it's about bringing people together." He paused the recording, letting the weight of the year's journey settle over him. The movement wasn't just continuing, it was evolving, finding new expressions in each community it touched. What had begun as a response to rejection had become a revolution in how people thought about hospitality, culture, and community. And somewhere, in another city, another person was facing another closed door, about to be inspired to create something new. The table, Snoop knew, would keep growing, making room for every story yet to be told.